It started with a wind so cold it felt like it could scrape the bones clean. Men who were used to hunger, fear, and the constant crash of artillery found themselves stunned by something far quieter, a storm that erased the world. By noon, Stalingrad had vanished behind a curtain of white, buildings, bodies, even the sky, all drowned in the same color. Somewhere inside that storm, a man crouched behind a broken chimney, his breath freezing on his scarf. Vasily Zaytsev had fought through days when the city shook like a trapped animal, but this silence unsettled him more than any shelling. There was no horizon, no shadows, no shapes to aim at. Only the wind, howling like it had something to say. He closed his eyes, not out of fear, but because they were useless now. Vision belonged to the blizzard. Hearing, though, that was still his. A faint scrape drifted through the storm, metal against ice, then another, soft, hesitant, as if someone was trying not to exist. Zaytsev let the sound settle in his mind. Distance, direction, weight. He could almost picture the man making it, a German soldier, maybe clutching his coat tighter, maybe praying the snow would hide him. The cold pressed harder. Snowflakes bit at his cheeks. Somewhere to his left, another sound, a boot shifting. Not the same man, a second one, maybe more. He steadied his rifle. Breath in, breath held. The world narrowed to a single point he could not see. The shot cracked like a piece of the storm breaking off. A body fell. He didn't see it, but the muffled thud told him enough. Then another sound, someone dropping to a knee, fumbling for cover they couldn't find. Zaytsev moved his barrel an inch, maybe less, guided only by the tremor of boots on frozen debris. Another shot, another heavy silence. The blizzard thickened, turning every breath into needles. Yet in that white chaos, he felt something shift. Not victory, not triumph, just the weight of what lay ahead. The storm wasn't letting up, and the Germans weren't done coming. Somewhere in that cold, he realized he might have to rely on sound alone for far longer than he wished. The blizzard had swallowed the city, and now it was swallowing the men trying to take it. And he wasn't sure how many footsteps he'd have to listen for before the storm finally passed. Before he ever touched a battlefield, there was a hilltop in the Urals where a young boy stood so still that even the goats seemed confused by him. Snow settled on his shoulders, melted and settled again. He hardly noticed. He was listening for the slightest rustle, the kind that meant a hare was about to dart from its hiding place. His grandfather watched from a distance, arms crossed, a quiet pride in the way the boy refused to rush. Life in those mountains didn't reward loudness. It rewarded the patient, the ones who knew how to hear the world before they acted. Vasily grew up in a wooden house where warmth came from a stubborn stove and stories came from evenings spent beside it. The old man spoke softly about the value of a single breath, the danger of wasting a shot, the way fear could blind a hunter faster than darkness. None of it sounded like lessons at the time. It just felt like family talk, the kind that settles into you without asking permission. On certain mornings, the frost hung so thick that even the trees looked tired. Vasily would step outside with his grandfather's old rifle, feeling the cold sting through his mittens. They'd walk side by side without many words. Sometimes the silence between them said more than the stories in the evenings ever could. When Vasily missed a shot, and he missed plenty, his grandfather never raised his voice. He would simply place a hand on the boy's shoulder and guide him back to the mark in the snow. "Look again," he'd say. "The mistake isn't the bullet. The mistake is rushing your heart." Those moments shaped him more than he realized. There were no medals in the mountains, no applause, no crowds. There was only wind, breath, and the quiet sense of responsibility that comes when you're taking a life to feed the family you love. Years later, in a ruined city far from home, he would find himself remembering those mornings, the crunch of snow, the steady heartbeat, the old man's calm voice. And in the middle of fear and fire, he carried a truth that started on those hills. If you learn to listen long enough, the world eventually tells you what you need to know. That lesson would follow him into places no boy from the Urals could have imagined. If you stood on the edge of Stalingrad in those days, the first thing you'd notice wasn't the smoke or the rubble. It was the sound, a deep, exhausted groan rising from a city that had taken more punishment than any place should. Buildings leaned like wounded men. Streets were carved open by craters wide enough to swallow trucks. And yet somehow, people kept moving through it all, as if the ground beneath them wasn't breaking apart. When Vasily arrived, the air felt strangely thick, like it carried every scream and every prayer at the same time. Soldiers shuffled past him with faces coated in dust, eyes half-glazed from nights without sleep. Civilians held on to whatever they could carry, pressing themselves into the shadows whenever planes circled overhead. Even the children moved quietly, as if noise itself had become dangerous. Every block looked like a half-finished thought, a factory wall still standing while the rest lay flattened, a stairwell rising into nothing, tram lines hanging like broken ribs. Fires burned without shape, flickering in places where no one could spare the water to put them out. Somewhere in the ruins, a dog barked once, and then went silent, as if remembering the city wasn't safe for creatures that didn't understand war. Vasily walked through it all with a knot forming in his throat. He had imagined hardship, but he hadn't imagined this kind of stubborn life, clinging to a place that seemed determined to fall apart. A mother huddled beside a cellar entrance, rocking her baby with hands cracked by cold. A group of workers, still in soot-covered overalls, dragged planks across a blown-out intersection, trying to fashion some kind of shelter. None of them looked defeated, just tired, painfully, quietly tired. And in the middle of the destruction, there were these strange pockets of stillness, moments when the shelling paused, and the only sound was the faint rattle of loose glass shifting in the wind. Those pauses didn't feel peaceful. They felt like the city catching its breath, uncertain if it had enough strength left for the next impact. Vasily felt something settle inside him then, a sort of promise he never said aloud. If the city was going to hold on, even by a thread, he would hold on with it. Not out of duty alone, but out of respect for the people who refused to bow their heads, even when the sky itself seemed to be falling. He looked at the ruins around him, at the stubborn traces of life buried under ash and snow. And he understood. This wasn't just a battlefield. It was a place that refused to die, no matter how hard the world tried to crush it. The first time Vasily held the rifle that would follow him through the worst days of the war, the world around him was strangely quiet, not silent. Stalingrad was never truly silent, but the nearby gunfire felt distant, almost muted, as if the city was giving him a moment to understand what he was about to carry. The weapon wasn't new. The stock had small dents, the metal worn in places where other hands had gripped it too tightly. A young armorer passed it to him with a look that said he wished he had something better to offer. But the moment Vasily wrapped his fingers around the stock, he felt a kind of steady familiarity. Tools didn't need to be pretty to be faithful. He lifted it to his shoulder, letting the weight settle. Old habits from the mountains surfaced, the way he aligned his cheek, the slow breath, the stillness in his arms. For a short second, he wasn't in a burning city. He was back on a frosty ridge, with his grandfather murmuring something soft beside him. A soldier nearby joked, "Don't get too attached. Nothing lasts long here." Vasily didn't answer. Attachment wasn't what this was. It was responsibility, the quiet kind that sits behind the ribs and stays there. Before heading out, he ran his thumb along the bolt one more time, feeling every groove. He made a small vow in his mind. Not about glory, not about numbers, just this. He would use the rifle to keep the men around him alive for as long as he could. If that meant long hours without blinking, so be it. If it meant taking a life to save a friend, he would carry the weight. War had a way of stripping people down until only their truest parts remained. For Vasily, that truth was simple. He couldn't control the chaos, but he could control a single breath, a single shot, a single moment when someone trusted him to intervene. As he prepared to step back into the shattered streets, he paused. The rifle felt heavier now, not because of its metal, but because it had become part of a promise he couldn't walk away from. And somewhere deep inside, he sensed that this promise would follow him far longer than the war itself. There was a morning when the smoke drifted low and slow, hanging just above the shattered rooftops like tired breath. Vasily lay in the rubble of a collapsed workshop, his cheek pressed against brick so cold it felt almost alive. Nothing moved at first, not the wind, not the shadows, just the faint ticking of a loose pipe tapping against a wall somewhere behind him. Those were the kinds of moments he learned to work with, the quiet ones that most soldiers feared because quiet usually meant something was creeping closer. His first real shot in the city wasn't dramatic. No grand duel, no perfect angle. Just a German soldier stepping out from behind a burned-out tram, shoulders tense, scanning the street for threats he couldn't quite name. The man paused for a moment, adjusting the strap of his pack. A small, human movement, the kind Vasily recognized from home, the motion of someone who's tired and cold and trying to keep going. Vasily steadied his breath. There was a tiny shiver in his hands from the chill, but otherwise he was still. He didn't think about numbers or reputation. He thought about the men sleeping in the basement nearby, relying on him to keep the path clear. The shot came quick, clean. The soldier dropped without a cry, sinking into the snow like a man folding into an unwanted rest. Vasily waited. Always wait. His grandfather had drilled that into him. Don't trust the first silence. Sometimes it lies. Minutes dragged by. Then a second soldier rushed to help the fallen one, calling out with a voice that cracked halfway through. That sound, that fear, cut through Vasily more sharply than recoil ever could. War didn't give space for sympathy. But moments like that never left a man untouched. Another shot, another body stilling in the cold. Word spread faster than he expected. By dusk, men he'd never spoken to were nodding at him with a kind of cautious gratitude. Someone muttered, "The new sniper keeps the streets breathing." Another said, "If he's watching, we'll see home." Vasily didn't feel larger because of it. If anything, the praise felt heavier on his shoulders than the rifle itself. The nights grew colder. The hunts grew longer. He listened for footsteps, the click of a helmet brushing brick, the scrape of a boot against glass. Often he worked without seeing more than a blur. Stalingrad wasn't generous with visibility, but sound. Sound always told the truth before sight did. One evening, after taking down 3 soldiers who had tried to slip through a shattered rail yard, Vasily found himself staring at his own hands. They didn't shake, they didn't tremble, they just rested there, steady and tired. He wondered briefly when that steadiness had become part of him, and whether it would ever leave. Somewhere deep in the ruins, another distant shot rang out. Not his, not friendly. Someone else was hunting too. And for the first time, he felt the faint chill of being watched. There came a morning when the air felt strangely tense, as if the city itself knew a rumor was passing through its broken streets. Vasily sensed it first in the way his comrades looked at him, not with awe, not with fear, but with a quiet awareness. Something had changed overnight. He learned the reason when a young scout slid beside him behind a half-collapsed wall. The boy's face was flushed from running, his breath fogging in the cold. "They're talking about you," he whispered, "across the river, in their trenches." Vasily didn't answer right away. A bullet cracked somewhere down the street, ricocheting through the bones of a burnt apartment block. The scout waited for the echo to fade before speaking again. "They're saying there's a shadow picking them off, a ghost in the rubble." He hesitated, then added, "They're using your name now." Hearing it aloud felt strange. Zaytsev, a simple name from a simple place, now drifting in the mouths of men who wanted him dead. He wasn't sure whether to feel troubled or indifferent. Names had never mattered much in the mountains, only actions did. But in war, names carried weight. They shaped fear. They shaped intention. As days passed, he felt the shift more clearly. German patrols moved differently. They approached corners slower, shoulders hunched, rifles ready long before danger appeared. They scanned rooftops not for snipers, but for one sniper, him. Their caution told him he was no longer just another Soviet rifle in the ruins. He had become something sharper, something they desperately needed to stop. Yet he didn't feel pride, only a heavier sense of responsibility. Because attention meant danger, not only for him, but for the men around him. When the enemy started speaking your name, it meant they were preparing something. No army let a threat grow unchecked. One night, while the wind slapped snow against empty windows, he sat with two comrades in the basement of a ruined printing shop. One of them joked that he should be honored to be feared. The other said fear could be a weapon if you used it right. Vasily didn't smile. He just stared at the flame of a makeshift candle flickering in a bottle and felt a quiet truth settle in his stomach. If the enemy was saying his name, it meant he was no longer hunting alone. Someone, somewhere, had been given the task of hunting him back. Everything began with a whisper carried by a courier who stumbled into command one evening, face blue from cold, boots stiff with frozen mud. He spoke quickly, the way men do when they're repeating something they shouldn't have heard. "A marksman has arrived on their side," he said. Not just any marksman. Someone they trust. Someone brought in for one reason. No one had to ask what that reason was. The officers said little, but their eyes shifted toward Vasily with a mixture of caution and respect. A few minutes later, one quietly pulled him aside and handed him a cup of bitter tea. "There's a specialist among the Germans," the officer murmured. "He knows your pattern. He studies every place you fired from. He waits longer than most, moves slower than most." A pause. "He isn't here for the city. He's here for you." The words settled like cold ash in Vasily's chest. Not fear, more like a weary acceptance. If he had been another man, maybe he would have bragged or shrugged it off. But he simply nodded. In war, every action eventually circles back. This was his circle. In the following days, the ruins felt different. The air seemed to hold its breath. A wrong step echoed longer than usual. A loose brick rolling too far, a glint of metal on a distant ledge that vanished before he could decide whether it had been real. The unseen marksman moved with a kind of patience Vasily understood well. It was the patience of someone who knew that 1 second, one real opening, was worth more than 100 rushed shots. Their first unspoken meeting happened in a courtyard filled with broken pipes and a rusted swing set coated in ash. Vasily had set up a position behind a concrete slab, waiting to cover a small reconnaissance team. He scanned the windows, the doorways, the roof lines. Nothing. But something felt off. A pressure, an awareness. As if someone was watching him with the same steady breath he used on others. Then a fragment of brick exploded centimeters from his cheek. Not a wild shot, a warning, a test. Vasily rolled back behind cover, heart steady but alert. Whoever fired that round wasn't guessing. He had read the terrain perfectly. He had nearly ended the fight before it truly began. The city reacted almost immediately. Soviet soldiers tightened their routes, staying lower, moving faster between shadows. Some whispered about the duel now simmering beneath the greater battle. Others avoided talking about it altogether, as if naming it might tempt fate. Vasily said little. He listened more. For footsteps on metal, for the drag of cloth against plaster, for any detail that separated this single hunter from the hundreds of ordinary soldiers spread through the ruins. One night, while lying awake in a half-collapsed stairwell, he felt the weight of the situation push down on him. This wasn't like the blizzard hunts. This wasn't 40 men lost in the snow. This was one man, deliberate and disciplined, someone who understood the strange, wordless connection between two snipers who knew they might never see each other clearly until the final moment. And somewhere out there, in the cold ribs of the ruined city, that man was listening too, waiting for the smallest mistake. There were corners of Stalingrad where sound behaved strangely. Whispers bounced off metal beams and traveled farther than shouts. Footsteps softened when they crossed ash, but echoed sharply on shattered tiles. Vasily learned these quirks the same way a man learns the creaks of an old house, by living inside them long enough. One afternoon, he slipped into a ruined workshop with no roof and walls that ended abruptly, as if sliced away by a giant blade. The floor was covered in glass, each piece catching the faint winter light like tiny frozen sparks. He eased his weight onto a beam, avoiding the crunch. Even the slightest noise could give him away now. The German marksman, the ghost stalking him, had made sure of that. What saved Vasily again and again wasn't just skill. It was this strange relationship he formed with the ruins. The city had become a living thing, brittle ribs of brick, open-throated streets, windows that stared without blinking. The walls spoke to him in small ways. A shifting stone meant someone had placed weight where there shouldn't be any. A faint echo meant a step hit hollow ground. A scrape meant a rifle being moved by hands that weren't ready to fire. Sometimes when the wind cut through the holes in the buildings, the whole place sighed like an old man trying to stay awake. His comrades joked that he had grown extra senses. In truth, he had only learned how to let the city talk. Sight wasn't enough here. Stalingrad was a maze of dead angles and blind corners. If you relied on your eyes alone, you were already lost. One evening, while shadows stretched long across the rubble, he heard a faint metallic click. Too careful to be accidental, he froze. Whoever made it was skilled. A door hinge wouldn't move that softly by chance. He slowly backed away, breath shallow. The German sniper was close, and the walls, the beams, the broken panes of glass, all of them felt like they were waiting to see who would slip first. The storm rolled in without warning, swallowing the streets in minutes. Snow blew sideways, furious and blinding, turning the world into a white tunnel with no beginning or end. Men on both sides cursed and stumbled as the wind shoved them around like toys. For Vasily, it felt like stepping back into the mountains of his youth, except this time, the silence carried danger instead of peace. He and a small Soviet unit had taken shelter in the remnants of a warehouse when they heard it. Faint movement outside, uneven and growing closer. Someone shouted that German troops were advancing, using the storm as cover. The officer in charge muttered something about suicide, but fear crept into his voice. Sight was nearly useless. Shapes appeared and disappeared instantly in the whirl of snow. Vasily crawled toward a broken window frame, heart steady, ears open. The storm became an amplifier. The wind pushed every sound in strange directions, but certain details still cut through. The crunch of boots on crusted snow, the click of a rifle bolt freezing for a split second, the quiet hiss of breath behind a scarf. He closed his eyes. Sight would lie to him now. Sound wouldn't. A soft shuffle, left side, someone stepping around debris. He shifted his muzzle just a fraction and fired. A muffled collapse followed, swallowed almost instantly by the storm. Voices, not clear words, just the urgent tone of men trying to reorganize. Two sets of footsteps rushed forward, stopping abruptly as one slipped. Vasily caught the rhythm. One heavy, one lighter. They were close. Another shot, then another. The storm carried away everything except the sound of bodies hitting snow. Inside the warehouse, the soldiers watched him work with a mix of awe and dread. They could barely make out shapes a few meters away, yet Vasily was striking men he couldn't possibly see. One whispered a prayer. Another tightened his grip on his rifle as if clinging to courage through touch alone. The blizzard thickened. More footsteps emerged, scattered and hesitant. Someone barked an order in German, the wind chopping it apart. The unit outside must have been larger than expected, not a patrol, but a full movement. Vasily steadied himself again. A metallic rattle, likely a helmet brushing a beam. Fire, a clumsy slide, someone losing footing on ice. Fire, a gasp, too sharp and quick, a man realizing too late he'd stepped into an exposed spot. Fire. He did this again and again until he lost track of how many shapes the storm had delivered to him. Inside, the Soviet soldiers barely dared to breathe. The only consistent sound was the rifle cycling in his hands. Calm, rhythmic, almost frightening in its certainty. The snow piled against the walls. The world shrank to sound alone. Then came one final cluster of footsteps, frantic, disorganized, pushing all at once. Maybe they thought rushing as a group would overwhelm him. Maybe panic drove them into foolishness. It didn't matter. Each movement had a signature. Each breath revealed a direction. Each scrape built a picture sharper than sight. One shot, another, then three more in quick succession. Silence followed, deep enough to make the men inside the warehouse hold their breath in unison. When the storm finally began to thin, shapes emerged outside, still forms, half buried in white, scattered across the snow like fallen markers. Later, someone counted the bodies. Around 40 men, all brought down in that blinding storm. Vasily didn't say anything when he heard the number. He didn't feel triumph, just a quiet heaviness. Those men had been lost in a storm they'd hoped would hide them, and he had been the one listening in the dark. The day the duel finally began, the sun hung weakly behind a veil of smoke, giving the city a dull copper tint. Vasily crouched inside a cratered fountain, snow filling the cracks between fallen stones. Across the square, maybe 100 meters away, the German sniper hid somewhere inside a wrecked factory, a place with too many shadows and too many angles. Vasily didn't move for a long time. Neither did his opponent. It was a strange kind of standoff, built not on action but on patience. Each man waited for the other to blink, to exhale too loudly, to shift weight at the wrong second. Hours passed. The cold crept up his legs, stiffening his joints. A distant artillery shell boomed, sending dust drifting through the air like tired confetti. Still he didn't move. Then faintly he heard it, a soft scrape, almost polite. Metal on brick. Too careful to be anything but deliberate, he adjusted his position by the smallest margin, barely enough to count as movement. His opponent responded instantly. A shot cracked and shattered a stone a hand's width from his head. Chips of frozen mortar stung his cheek. Not a guess, not luck. The German had read him. Vasily pressed himself lower, heart steady but alert. He replayed the scrape in his mind. Angle, distance, tone. Somewhere above ground level, near a beam. Probably a makeshift firing hole carved into the rubble. He waited. The cold tightened around him like a vice. Minutes stretched into something longer, heavier. His breath felt loud to his own ears, though he knew it wasn't. A pigeon fluttered from a nearby roof, startled by something he couldn't see. And then he heard it, a second scrape, just a thread of a sound. The German adjusting again, possibly moving his rifle to a new angle. Vasily breathed out slowly, one calm exhale. Then he rose a few centimeters, lined up the shot, and fired through a gap no wider than a fist. A cry followed, short, pained, then silence. He didn't move toward the factory, not yet. A dying sniper could be as dangerous as a healthy one. He waited until he was sure the quiet wasn't a trick. When he finally approached, he found the German slumped behind a beam, eyes half open, expression almost peaceful. Not a monster, not a legend, just a man who had come to Stalingrad with orders and left with a single shot. Vasily lowered his head for a moment, feeling neither victory nor relief, only the strange, heavy calm that comes after two hunters finally meet in the open, and only one walks away. There were nights when the darkness felt heavier than the ruins above it. Vasily lay on a cot in a makeshift medical post, the smell of disinfectant mixing with smoke drifting in from somewhere outside. His leg throbbed where shrapnel had torn through it earlier that week. The doctor said he was lucky. He didn't feel lucky. He just felt tired. Around him, wounded soldiers groaned in their sleep. Some whispered names. Some begged for water. Others clutched blankets like lifelines. The war didn't end at night. It only grew quieter, which sometimes made it worse. Vasily closed his eyes, hoping for rest. But rest rarely came without a price. Faces drifted behind his eyelids. Men he had fired at. Men he never knew. Men who had walked into his crosshairs without ever realizing someone was watching them. He didn't see them clearly. Just flashes. A scarf, a helmet strap, a hand reaching out too late. He tried to tell himself it was necessary. And it was. But necessity didn't stop the memories from settling into the corners of his mind like stubborn shadows. One evening, a nurse with tired eyes sat beside him and changed his bandage. She asked if he ever felt afraid. He surprised himself by answering honestly, "Only when I stop feeling anything at all." She didn't ask more. She didn't need to. The wound in his leg healed slowly, but the deeper wounds, the ones that didn't bleed, stayed quiet and steady. He learned to carry them the way he carried his rifle, with acceptance, not pride. Sometimes when he stepped outside the medical post at dusk, he would hear distant gunfire echoing across the river. The sound didn't frighten him. It only reminded him that every minute of peace was borrowed from someone else's fight. He limped for a while after returning to duty. His comrades pretended not to notice, offering small acts of help without calling attention to them. That kindness grounded him more than any medal ever could. War would keep taking its pieces. He understood that. The only choice he had was whether he let the missing pieces hollow him out, or whether he found a way to stand anyway. And as he adjusted his rifle, steadying himself against a broken window frame, he realized something simple and painful. Accuracy had never been free. It always left a mark somewhere. Years later, long after the last smoke had drifted away from Stalingrad, an older Vasily stepped off a bus in a quiet town far from the ruins that had shaped him. The war was over, the medals tucked away in drawers, the rifles stored in museums. The world around him felt strangely calm, almost fragile in its peacefulness. He carried a small bag and walked with the same steady gait he had learned through pain and persistence. His hair had gone lightly gray at the edges. His eyes still carried that old, thoughtful weight, the kind that comes from seeing too much and speaking about it too little. People recognized his name sometimes. Neighbor might ask for a story. A student might write a letter. But he always answered gently, offering only the parts he felt belonged to the world. The rest he kept close, like fragile items wrapped in memory and tucked out of sight. He returned to the mountains whenever he could. The air there felt familiar, crisp, honest, unhurried. On one of those visits, he stood on a ridge at dawn, the same kind of place where he had once waited for hares beside his grandfather. Snow clung to the branches. Sunlight crept over the peaks. He breathed in the cold and let it settle inside him. A friend who had come along asked if he ever thought about the blizzard in Stalingrad, the one where he'd fired at men he couldn't see. Sometimes, he said quietly, but not the way people think. He didn't think about the number. He thought about the sound of boots he never saw, the weight of responsibility pressing against his ribs, the strange stillness between shots, the fear and the calm tangled together, and the understanding, the heavy, unspoken understanding that none of those men had walked into that storm wanting to die. When he looked back on the duel with the German sniper, it wasn't triumph he remembered. It was the moment he saw the man's face and realized it could have just as easily been his own fate lying there in the dust. Some evenings, as he sat on his porch listening to the distant hum of life around him, he wondered what became of the families of those 40 men in the blizzard. He wondered whether they ever found answers, or whether the storm had erased too much for anyone to know the full truth. He didn't blame them for not knowing. Some stories, he understood, could only be carried by the people who lived them, and even then, not in their entirety. As the years softened him, he found himself speaking more often about the people who fought beside him than about the shots he took. He talked about the nurse who changed his bandages with quiet patience, about the scout who brought news with shaking hands, about the workers who dug trenches with frozen fingers and refused to leave their city. He had been called a legend. He had been called many things. But when he looked at the mountains, at the snow settling gently on the ground, he felt like something far simpler, a man who had done what he could in a place that asked too much from everyone. And in the fading light of evening, with the cold brushing softly against his cheek, he allowed himself a small, private truth, one he never said aloud. The storm had never really left him, but he had learned to walk home anyway.